I'm Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, and we've decided to do a podcast called We Don't Have to Choose. Why that title? Well, several years ago, I heard Rachel Barko give a presentation at the University of Minnesota, and she said that if the criminal legal system was a private corporation, it would have been bankrupt years ago. And that got me to thinking, why? Why does the criminal legal system not work to keep us safe? And what will keep us safe? That's what we're going to talk about on the podcast, that we don't have to choose between public safety and reform or changes or advancement, that those things we are trying to do here at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office will bring us public safety. So, Jeff, I think I might have mentioned in my email that this podcast is called We Don't Have to Choose. The idea being we don't have to choose between public safety and reform, because the system hasn't really been about public safety anyway. And my first guest was Rachel Barko, who talked about, I heard her talk several years ago at the University of Minnesota, and she said if the criminal legal system was like a private corporation, it would have been bankrupt years ago. And so I had her on as the first guest, and you are our third guest, I think. And I'm really excited about this. You're the person I think that everybody who's a data geek for the criminal legal system looks to for not just data, but really analysis of trends. So can you talk a little bit about your background and yeah, just tell us a little bit about your background now.
Yeah, so I took statistics in high school is basically my statistical background. I took AP statistics, and I think I took a class in grad school as well on that. But I'm a New Orleans native, was in DC for 7 years. I did intel analysis for CIA and DoD, and so sort of decided to move back home. And I had a skill set that in DC, everybody has a master's, everybody can do analysis, everybody can do anything. But in New Orleans, we don't analyze any of our problems, and we have problems up the wazoo. And so they hadn't had a crime analyst down here in decades, and so I had got the city to eventually hire me to be the first crime analyst in decades. And they stuck me in a closet and had no idea what to do with a crime analyst. And so I said, all right, I'll just start doing this on my own. And um, I was taught in my first jobs with the US government how to think and write and analyze evidence. And sometimes that's data, sometimes it's softer evidence. But I started applying that to crime data and crime trends and realized that there was nobody sort of explaining what the trends were. And our crime data collection system is antiquated. It's I'll take my glasses off so I have a little bit less glare. So it's, we don't have we haven't had any crime data since September of last year, published by the FBI. They stopped doing the quarterly data, which they just did for a few years. So really, we're looking at 10 months between data releases. And a year ending. And so it'll be, if you want to analyze what happened in January 2024, you have to wait till September, October 2025 to get that data formally from the FBI. So a lot of what I do is just taking the various data sources of just a ton of places, just publish it now in a way that they didn't 15 years ago. And so we can do that, and we can be much faster. And we already know that our publicly available data kind of sucks anyway in terms of precision. So if the formal stuff is not great in precision, we don't have to worry about the informal stuff being exactly precise, even if it just tells us what the trends are.
So can you talk about the current state of public data on the criminal legal system? There's a lot to say, but it's very imperfect, to say the least. Can you just talk a little bit about that? What are the sources? Where are there weaknesses there?
Yeah, so just a few weaknesses, I would say. And my world, we've done consulting. We've worked with a handful of prosecutors, but for the most part, we work in the crime data space. Of course, a crime occurs. Sometimes it gets successfully reported to the police. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes when the crime is reported to the police, it leads to an arrest. Sometimes that arrest leads to a prosecution. Sometimes that prosecution leads to somebody being found guilty or not guilty. So you're sort of like whittling down from an incident to in the criminal legal system. But so where I tend to operate is kind of in that first span where something occurs, is or is not reported to the police, and the police, eventually make a report and it becomes a crime statistic. So that world is really weird because we have the FBI, which is the arbiter and has been the arbiter for a century of this information. They tend to be very slow. They tend to be very methodical. They have done some things recently where they've tried to various degrees of success to get data faster out to people. They started quarterly reporting 5 years ago. They stopped doing quarterly reporting and have said they're going to start doing monthly reporting, but obviously there's a lot of questions about what's happening in federal data sets right now. So it's not something that we inherently know. I don't have a ton of confidence that monthly data is coming. And if it does come, it's going to be unaudited and in need of a lot of help. But in theory, the FBI is getting faster. On the other hand, we have this sort of revolution. There's never been a better time to get public crime data from agencies and especially from states. Not every state, but probably 15 or so, 15 to 20 states are publishing current year data as they get it from their agencies. And so you wait a couple of weeks and you have that agency's data for the most recent completed month. Minnesota does it, although the Minnesota dashboard is frustrating to operate as a power user of these types of things. But Minnesota, I think by law, all of the local agencies have to report it, and they have to report it up the chain to the public. So you've got lots of states, and it's a weird thing because it's not at all a red-blue issue. Texas is probably the best place for getting crime data right now. Pennsylvania does a really good job. Illinois does a really good job of publishing this data now after having been kind of the black sheep of the family in terms of not publishing data for years in the 80s and the 90s. California does a really bad job, but individual agencies do a good job in California, so it's sort of hit or miss.
So can I jump in there and
Yeah.
for people who may not know this, so crime is mostly local. So we're talking about police agencies throughout the country. Certainly there's the FBI, federal agencies, but the data that you're talking about that the FBI is trying to pull comes from individual agencies and states. Is that right?
Yeah, so every state has a state UCR program. And so the way it works is if you're the victim of a auto theft, you call the police. Usually auto theft we know gets reported a lot because you need the item number from the police to make your insurance claim.
Right.
So that's, other than murder, that's the most successfully reported crime that there is. So you call the police come, they take a report, that report gets written up. Most places they have exceedingly low clearance rate, so it never comes to you. But the report, you get a one added in that month's total for the agency's auto theft numbers. Occasionally you'll have, 3 weeks later, you're like, oh wait, I parked it on that block. It's not stolen. It's just, I lost it. And so you call the police and they'll take that off of the auto theft. But for the most part, that gets in the statistic. Most places on a monthly basis, they will then send that data to their state UCR program. In a lot of places, this is the Department of Public Safety, it's the Attorney General's office. And so the state UCR program will take all that, they'll audit it, they'll make sure that everything's being coded correctly, and then they will eventually, they really have until next spring to send this year's data. They will send that to the FBI. The FBI will take that from all of the states, and then they will put it together and they will put out their report sometime for 2025 in the fall of 2026.
So to make it very local for our listeners, let's say the Minneapolis Police Department is collecting data, they send that to, and it's our BCA, Department of Public Safety, Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and that's the dashboard. And then the state sends it on to the FBI. And so that's in part why there's that lag with FBI data.
Yeah, and so the FBI is getting it. There are some states that send the data within 5 minutes of when they get it. So the FBI has it, and it's not perfect. It's not audited. It's not reviewed in any way, but they're sending that raw stuff to the FBI within 5 minutes of them getting it. There are other states where, because of the technology they're using, they get it in essentially a spreadsheet format. They have to go through it. They have to make sure everything's filled out. It can take them 4 to 6 weeks just to make sure everything's filled out. If they find an error, they have to go back to the agency, and then they have to get the agency to fix, and that takes another 4 to 6 weeks. So maybe every 6 months they're sending it to the FBI. And then there are some states, they send it once a year on the deadline because they aren't participating that well, or they just don't have their technological act together. And so because it's a very federated system, it varies very much from state to state.
So, how does the FBI account for the fact that different states call things by different names? And some things that sound like felonies here in Minnesota, if you look at a record from Illinois, for instance, they're not felonies. So, how does the FBI account for that?
So with the FBI, there's no felony or misdemeanor differentiation. All they care about is the act. And so they have definitions of what the act is. And they tell the states, and the states tell the agencies, they train them basically, this is an aggravated assault. This is what makes up a criminal homicide. This is what makes up a burglary versus a theft versus an auto theft. And so it's up to the agencies to basically say, for my legal system, when I want to charge this person, I use one set of standards. When I want to tell the FBI what type of crime occurred, I'll use a different type of standard. And so we have basically a standard set of rules that applies to crime across the country with every agency. And it's helpful that we've been doing it the same way for 100 years. So it's not like we're changing that up frequently or anything like that. It does create a lot of confusion because I'm in Louisiana. Louisiana has a list of 50 different violent crimes and statutes that go into what makes up a violent crime. The FBI says it's a murder, a rape, a robbery, or an aggravated assault, and it has very specific definitions that don't always fit a Louisiana violent crime. And so you can report on violent crime numbers in Louisiana using Louisiana statutes, or you can report based on how the FBI does it, and those will not match up because they're different definitions. So it can get confusing, but there is a standardization across agencies that make it plausible to do it for all 50 states.
So, you mentioned clearance rates a little bit there. Could you describe what a clearance rate is, or is there a standard definition of what a clearance rate is?
There is. And so a clearance rate is basically, if you were to make the most maddening statistic to follow possible, you would call it a clearance rate. So the way it's a math equation, if we all put on our 7th grade calculus hats, and
7th grade calculus.
I don't know when I took calculus. I may not have even taken calculus. I mean, that's maybe why I took statistics, because all the better math students did calculus. So our 7th grade algebra, we'll say. So you've got the numerator, and the numerator is the number of offenses that you clear. And I'll break this answer down into 2 parts. So let's just assume clear for now is basically like an arrest, the number of cases that you solve in a given year. So 2024, Minneapolis Police Department solved 24 murders. It doesn't matter what year those murders were. So if a guy is shot in 1978 and you know who did it and you arrest that person, they serve their sentence, they get out, whatever, that person dies in 2024, that becomes a 2024 murder and a 2024 clearance. If you solve a 1998 murder in 2024, that's a 2024 clearance. The denominator, though, is just the number of crimes that occurred in that year. So if you have a double murder that occurs on December 31st of 2024, and you have one murder in 2025 that you don't solve, and but you solve that 2024 murder that occurred the day before the year ended, you would report a 200% murder clearance rate in 2024. just because, or in 2025, just because you solved that one murder and you solved it in this year. And it creates a really confusing situation because police have all sorts of lingo that they used. And so you can think that there's the clearance rate, that's the FBI definition. There's the arrest rate. What percentage of this year's murders did you make an actual arrest in? There were 30 murders this year and we made 10 arrests in 10 of those murders. So that's a 33% arrest rate. And then there's a solve rate that police departments will use because they say, okay, we know who did it. We issued a warrant. We did our job. Internally, we're calling that a solve. And it gets in trouble. I always use this example. I was presenting before the New Orleans City Council. It was in January. There had been something like 10 murders that year. They had made an arrest in 2 of those murders. They had made an arrest in 2 murders from the previous year, and then they had issued a warrant in 4 murders for the previous year. And so you're talking about a 20% arrest rate, a 40% clearance rate, and an 80% solve rate, all describing the exact same data. And so it makes it really difficult. And then you get into the other issue, which is that a clearance is broken down by a clearance by arrest, physical custodial arrest, and a clearance by exception, where there are a number of different rules that the FBI says that basically if you know who did it and you cannot physically arrest that person, you have enough evidence to charge that person, but you can't do it or you can't get a prosecution because of it, then you can say it's cleared by exception and add it to your clearance, and that it goes into your clearance rate. So that is a long answer of a very confusing and difficult statistic.
No, I am glad. We've been having conversations here about clearance rates, and that's actually what I was looking at my desk to pull some of the clearance rates. So in Minneapolis, I think it was 2023, we had about 7,500 car thefts. And as you pointed out, car thefts are actually a crime that is more likely to be reported because of the insurance situation. Unlike, a lot of other crimes are never actually reported to the police, but at least for car theft, we had something like 7,500. And the clearance rate, I believe, was 1.6%. It was definitely under 2%. And the way it was defined here, I think by the BCA, was that clearance rate was a case that was submitted to us by law enforcement. And so sometimes here, law enforcement can arrest somebody, but if they don't submit a case to us, we don't have the opportunity, if you want to put it that way, to charge it. So we know, and I think this is a trend across the country too, that clearance rates for car theft are very low. And I know you've followed a lot of car theft because that was a particular indicator across the country. Car theft went way up. Can you talk a little bit about, Kia, Hyundai, the car theft phenomena, perhaps since COVID and George Floyd?
Yeah, so somebody on TikTok posted in June or July, of 2022, that it was really easy to steal certain models of Kias and Hyundais. Basically, all you needed was a thumb drive, and it would act as a key in those models. And what you saw is pretty much overnight a huge surge in the number of auto thefts that were occurring each year in a number of cities. New Orleans went from like 2,000 to 3,000 auto thefts over the course of a year before that to somewhere around 8,000 or 9,000 in 2023, the first full year where this trick existed. Overall, nationwide, there was an enormous increase, something like 12 or 13%, and it was really pronounced in cities. Minneapolis went from like 4,000 in 2021 to over 8,000 in 2022. And it's one of those rare occasions where usually crime changes slowly. It goes up slightly, it goes down slightly, and it's over time that you sort of see this change. It's rare that you see anything like this in crime trends because it's not something that happens like this overnight. And it happened almost everywhere. Milwaukee is an interesting case study because apparently it was circulating in Milwaukee before it got posted on TikTok. And so if you actually look at Milwaukee a year ahead of the huge surge, there was this huge surge in Milwaukee. And so that's really interesting, I think. I'm very surprised that there hasn't been, I mean, maybe there has been like class action lawsuits against Kia and Hyundai, but it's one of those rare, really rare trends where it's obvious in the data, the cause is obvious, the solution maybe not as obvious, but there's also, usually we want to say, well, what are the police doing? What are the police doing wrong? What are they doing right? And there's nothing that they could do or could have done to prevent this from happening. It's just a thing that happened, and it's been fascinating to watch because now we're on the other side of it. There's a finite number of Kias and Hyundais to steal. There's, people could get the club. There were technological fixes that you could drive your car to the dealer and get. And so now we're seeing on the other end this enormous decline in auto thefts occurring.
Yeah, and in terms of police being able to prevent it, or even I think some of the reasons that the clearance rates were really low is because what we were seeing here in Minneapolis, and I assume you were seeing across the country, there would be a lot of kids or young people that would steal cars in groups, and they were wearing masks sometimes and similar clothing. They would take the car, sometimes crash it or ditch it, and it was just really difficult for police to be able to uh, get a case strong enough to submit to us. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you, was there a difference between red states and blue states when it came to car theft?
Not really. It was, I mean, you could say there was only that there are more cars in big cities, and so you tended
Hmm.
to see this trend play out more in big cities.
Hmm.
And big cities tend to be bluer than not. So I don't know that I certainly wouldn't think it was a political issue or a red blue thing. I think it's just, it happened in a lot of cities. And you're right, if you have a 1.5 to 3% clearance rate on auto thefts, there's very little, certainly nothing you can do from a prosecution standpoint to deter. But we know that the thing that deters people is the certainty and swiftness of getting caught.
Right.
And if you know that your odds are 1 in 50 of getting caught, and you're already making a stupid decision to commit a crime, then you're going to go ahead and do that and there's no deterrent value in essentially the entire criminal legal system.
Yeah, and actually that's in using data too here, we were seeing 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds stealing cars, and the data here, the intelligence data was telling us that those kids, when they were stealing cars, it was just a matter of months before they might escalate to a carjacking or, something more violent. So one of the things when we met with police, they said, we know who these kids are. We just can't bring you a case. And you're right in that typically the prosecutor's office can't do anything unless law enforcement can bring us a case. But we created a brand new youth auto theft initiative where we said to law enforcement, well, why don't you give us the names and we'll run them through all of our databases, child protection, youth prosecution, and the county database to see if these kids and their families are receiving any kind of services. What surprised me was that half of the kids that were referred to us were not getting services of any kind. And so we started out this pilot, which is no longer a pilot, but having our social worker reach out to the family or caretaker. And the family or caretaker always said, it's not surprising that our kid was on your radar screen. Please help. And so then we referred, or our social worker would refer that family to tailored services based on what that child or the family needed, whether it was food security, clothing, mental health, help, substance use, all of that. And we checked the data after a year and 3 months, and we had not seen 81% of those kids re-referred to us, which is pretty remarkable for criminal legal justice or criminal legal system data, I think, to have that higher rate. But it was a program we designed understanding that there were difficulties bringing prosecution or bring the or legal or police bringing us cases, and understanding that deterrence is if you think you're going to get caught and caught quickly. So it's been an amazing program that we're really proud of. I Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that, yeah, you kind of look at the data, and I'm thinking about Portland, where something like 75% of vehicles were recovered within 30 days, typically, and with the Kias and Hyundais stolen during this time frame, it was over 90%, maybe even 95%. And so I think that the motivation for these crimes was not as was different than the motivation behind others. And there's a lot that we don't know. It's something that we just sort of described, but has not been, I think they'll be studied chronologically for a long time.
So I wanted to follow up on that. One of the things that I really enjoy that you do is to analyze trends. So you can look at data, but what are we supposed to make of it? So can you talk a little bit about how you analyze trends, or maybe even when you decide something is a trend?
Um, yeah, it's difficult, I think, for certain things. The the challenge is that we're working with very imperfect data and the trends are not inherently obvious. I think that typically the key is to look for longer term and not overreact to shorter term thoughts. And so typically, it's the type of thing that it's sort of cumulative. You kind of have thought in the back of your mind that maybe this is something worth paying attention to. And then 6 months down the road, you've been looking at it each month and you see that it looks like more of a trend. I think what's helpful is that we've got enough cities of data, and things have become sort of nationalized. What we're seeing is generally not local factors driving these trends for the most part. It's usually national factors. And so when murder went up, it went up everywhere. And in general, we're seeing massive declines in crime pretty much everywhere, especially the first quarter of this year. And so it's a matter of, as a year goes on, pretty much March, April, you kind of start to think this is interesting. Um, the summer, you say this is beyond interesting. This is the trend we're seeing so far this year, and yeah, there's time for this to reverse. But usually, if it's the trend through the summer, it's going to be the trend past the summer as well. And so it sort of allows you to evaluate crime, policing, all sorts of things, find the data that exists and understand um, what is real and what is, okay, I need to hold my horses and not talk about these types of things.
So that one thing that's interesting to me, we've had I don't think, and I'm not sure I'm current on this, but we've had a murder in something like 54 days, which is a unusual in Minneapolis. And one thing that I hear police talking about, or people generally sometimes tend to give police credit for, oh, this is because of X, Y, and Z. And I heard you say before, we have to really be looking at the long term. Can you talk about, when people try to attribute particular factors for I would say short term from what you're talking about, drops or increases? Can you talk about that and how we are supposed to look at that?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to, it's very much a, failure is an orphan, success has many parents type
Yes.
situation.
Yes.
Um, I mean, I'll never forget in July of 2022, New Orleans had the most murders of the highest murder rate of any year in 2022 than any year since before Katrina, and had the nation's highest murder rate. City of 370,000 having 266 murders, up from 119 in 2019. So within 3 years, this enormous doubling of the murder rate. And in July of that year, the police department came out with a statement after finishing June, where June had, I think, was the month that had like 30 something murders and was the highest number of murders in any month since like 2004, so well before Katrina. And police department basically said, listen, we can't police interpersonal conflict, was their response to this. And it was like, it was maddening because nobody blames the police, but for like the increase that was occurring everywhere. But or at least I didn't, but also like I'm going to blame you if you say that you can't do anything about it, because that's not a good response. And so usually when things go up, it's, whoa, there's other factors involved. This is not something that
Mhm.
we're responsible for. And there's very often a hint of truth to that. And when things go down, it's, we started X program, so X program must be responsible for it. And there's very rarely cases, but there are cases where you can say, you started X program, we studied it. There's very clear, very strong answers, evidence that this is responsible. Like, yes, that's true. But more often than not, it's these things are complicated and everything went up nationally, everything's going down nationally. It's probably not that you're posting officers every third block in the high murder neighborhoods. That's probably not the driving factor. And so I think that being in a position to see the trends and point out, like, one, how frequent it is and how it's happening everywhere. And two, being able to show that it's happening everywhere. And look, it started, a year before you started this program. Or again, sorry to keep bringing up Louisiana. The governor, New Orleans is having amazing year, even despite the fact that we had that Bourbon Street attack tragedy that killed 14 people on January 1st. And the governor who started in 2024 is talking about how, like, oh, it must be all of these things and these things that I did. And you can point to, well, yeah, you have the state police in town, but they're only responsible for 4% of the arrests and 4% of the stops. So I doubt that that's that. And also the decline began at the end of 2022 or early 2023. Everything predated, all of these steps that were taken. So it's probably not these steps. Even if these steps maybe are helping, I don't want to, like, completely deny everybody credit for everything and say everything is random, but we're in a position, I think, with crime trends frequently to be able to describe them now. Explaining them, especially as they occur, is extraordinarily difficult. And too often it's, well, it must be the police or whatever steps they finally take. And we don't ever consider that, like, they did 10 other steps that they publicly announced and none of them did anything. And now we're going to say that it's this. So sometimes I think that the credit is due, but I think more frequently it's due to other factors.
Yeah, when I ran for this office in 2022, the my opponents were all predicting, I think because I was a former public defender, that crime would go up. And it didn't. It actually went down. And somebody wrote an op-ed saying, hey, if you thought crime was going up, would go up if Mary Moriarty was a prosecutor or the county attorney, don't you think she should get credit if it's going down? And I don't think that's the case at all. And I do think, we are doing some of these programs, but I certainly understand that crime going down is very difficult to get a handle on. So I wanted to ask you, how long does it typically take for criminologists to figure out the why? So you can see the trends in how do people look at the trends in terms of how they decide they have enough information to be able to describe the why?
I guess when they figure out why everything went down in the 90s, I'll tell you, I'll have a better idea. I mean, we have an understanding of the factors that led to it, everything going down in the 90s. We have an understanding of the factors, but, like, I liken it to, if you were to say, Jeff, here are the ingredients of the world's greatest chocolate cake. I want you to make it. Here's the butter, here's the chocolate, the flour, the sugar, all the, here's everything. I wouldn't have the first idea about what the process would be to make this cake. How much sugar do I put in? How much flour? What comes first? What comes second? And so I think that if we can do an okay job in the years following of understanding what the ingredients were, and I think that that's true. You can maybe 3 or 4 years afterwards, we sort of understand what the factors were, but it can take decades to very strongly know, with sort of like a capital K, exactly what the causes were and in what order and to what degree each factor played a role. And so I think that frequently, whenever I'm asked the why question, you can point to whatever the crime trends are. Here are some ideas that people have thrown about, and some of them make sense, and a lot of them don't. But we won't know for a long time, if ever, really, what the exact factors were, because it's so complicated.
And one thing I've read is prosecutors don't seem to make much of a difference, regardless of what cities they're in or whether it's blue or red state.
Yeah, I mean, I've tended to feel that. I know I'm speaking with a prosecutor right now, so I
That,
don't, I don't want to insult the profession. I think that, and I've talked about this frequently, that I see obviously the criminal justice system, the role of prosecutors is integral from a society standpoint. From a crime reduction standpoint, because you're dealing with typically crimes that have clearance rates ranging from 1 to 3% to murder, sometimes you'll get 50 to 60% in big cities. But even in the big cities where you have the Washington Post before COVID did a great story on places where you could murder with impunity, and they basically mapped out clearance rates by geographic location, and so they could show, this neighborhood. Again, sorry to go back to New Orleans, like the French Quarter, 100% of the murders are getting cleared. We know every person that did a murder in the French Quarter. You go a mile away to the 7th Ward, where there's traditionally been a lot of gun violence, and you're looking at 15% clearance rate. And so even within the communities, the harder cases are the ones that aren't getting cleared to begin with. And the ones that are more likely to spur future activity, retribution killings and things like that, are the ones that aren't even making it past the police wrote up a report stage and investigated stage. It makes it very difficult, I think, for prosecutors to have a ton of role in the specific realm of crime reduction. Now, prosecutor offices do lots of things that aren't strictly prosecuting cases that can have a role. They run programs, and you were talking about that earlier. But the traditional thought that you think of, like, is this person going to be tough on crime, or are they going to be a reform-minded prosecutor? I don't think that decision really decides whether or not crime goes up or crime goes down. The other factor, sorry to keep rambling here, but the final factor being that, let's say you have a murder, it might be 3-4 years before your office is successfully able to put it on trial due to all the legal ramblings. Let's say you have an auto theft. It may take 6 months to have an arrest, and then you have the entire process go about, and witnesses have moved. The victim was drunk that night and doesn't have a memory of what happened when he stumbled home and saw that his car was missing. All sorts of things that can happen that, your deterrent value in these prosecutions is so low, because who's going to remember how long it's been since the prosecution occurred of a case that was 3 years ago?
so that goes back to deterrent being based on certainty of getting caught and swiftness.
Yeah, and we have all of this evidence that points to that. And people who are not able to intuit what is the crime, like, is this a first-degree felony? Is this a second-degree felony? Is this a misdemeanor? How much can I shoplift and succeed? It's not like Price is Right, where you like try to add up to hit the threshold for the misdemeanor, and you need to be $1 under that. It's very much something that the people making decisions to commit crimes tend to not have any understanding of what happens in the legal system beyond, this is probably illegal. And so the response needs to be, if you do this crime, you're going to get caught. And what happens after that in terms of deterring future crime is probably not as important, is what all of the evidence shows. Which is not to say, like, if somebody is, murder somebody, we don't do the prosecution because of the deterrent value. We do it for the justice value. And so there's certainly value in that. But from a reducing future crime, reducing future murders, whether or not this case goes to trial, whether or not this person is convicted, and whether or not this person is gets the death sentence or life in prison, those probably don't have a ton of role.
So if we could talk about crime trends, I know much is talked about COVID and George Floyd's murder, which happened here in Minneapolis. What was going on with crime trends before those things, and what happened after?
So in 2019, we had the right about the kind of the 2 years that you think about the lowest murder rates and the lowest violent crime rates are 2014, 2019, especially in the violent crime rate, going back the last 5 decades. So 2014 had by far the lowest murder rate, I think, that we've ever recorded. 2019, the murder rate was above that, but the violent crime rate was like off by, 1.1 or zero point 0.5 or something, very, very, very close in terms of crimes per 100,000 to where it was in 2014. So you had a very low violent crime rate nationally. We've had 30 straight years of property crime falling. So, or 25 straight years of property crime falling, and that was continuing in 2019. And you sort of see in May, June, July 2020, there was this incredibly sharp spike in murder, an incredibly sharp spike in gun violence, a lesser increase in violent crime, but an increase nonetheless of a couple of percentage points nationally, and then a large dip in property crime because if shops aren't open, nobody can shoplift. So the property crime trend is clearly tied to what happened in COVID. The murder increase is much less obviously tied to COVID, but you could also make the argument that everything that happened in the summer of 2020 that probably make up the ingredients that led to this huge surge, you can't remove COVID from any of that. You can't remove those stresses. You can't remove how everybody was feeling getting outside for the first time and protesting and or whatever people were doing, or how police departments that had been badly overstretched in the months after COVID were basically pulling back in a lot of cases after the murder of George Floyd and in response to all these protests. So all of this stuff that was happening, you can't remove COVID from that. So it's not like COVID happened, snap, we saw this big increase. It was definitely a few months later. I did a podcast with Jerry Radcliffe a couple of years ago, and I always credit him for incepting this idea that I think is very, very valid and very important, that just because you had one thing cause the increase doesn't mean that that's what sustained it through 2021 and 2022. And so, yes, it was likely all of these factors in 2020 leading to the increase. Other factors very plausibly led to or contributed to it being sustained at this really high level. And then in 2023, we saw the largest one-year decline in murder ever recorded nationally, and we probably exceeded it in 2024. And so far in the first quarter of 2025, all of the data suggests that we're even lower in 2025.
So what are the other factors that might have contributed to the increase in 21 and 22?
Well, I think that, obviously the loss of police legitimacy, with Jill Leovy, if you read Ghetto Side, would talk about the state monopoly on violence, that sort of all of these things going away, leading to the creation of essentially this very difficult to interrupt cycle of violence. Obviously there were protests, there was depolicing, there were all of these factors, this changing of opinions on policing that happened after George Floyd. A lot of police departments lost officers. So even if they didn't want to depolice, they lost 20, 30% of their officer strength in the years that came after that. And then if you look at basically government spending, hiring, all of this money, these federal programs, these state programs and local programs that we would have counted on in normal times to interrupt this cycle of violence, we didn't have that in our toolkit until after 2022, essentially. So we basically had this huge surge in violence. We had this start of this cycle of violence that you have killings, you have retribution killings. Everybody's carrying firearms significantly more often than they were in before COVID. And just as an aside, Rob Arthur and I did research that looked at police stops in the months leading up to COVID and immediately after COVID, and then leading up to George Floyd. And we broke it down by the share of stops that had a firearm attached to it. And the percent, but basically using this as a metric to show that people were carrying more firearms more frequently leading up to George Floyd. And so you saw in city after city this huge increase in February, March, April 2020 in the percentage of stops where a firearm was present. And either one, police got really, really good all of a sudden at identifying which car to stop that has a firearm on it, or the share of people holding firearms skyrocketed during those very, stressful early days of COVID. And so you had all of these factors that, again, that didn't cause the increase, but that certainly could have been an accelerant on everything else that was happening. And then 2023, 2024, you get a lot of federal investment, you got a lot of state investment. If you look at like federal or state and local jobs, government jobs skyrocketing 2023, 2024. Construction on highways and streets from the state and the local level because of federal funding going through the roof in 2023 and 2024. So all of this funding helping and all these programs and all of these philanthropies operating to hopefully sort of reverse this cycle of violence. I think that's the most plausible explanation to me. And at this point, I've completely forgotten what the question was, but
No, that's okay. You did answer it. And are
that's
we,
basically what we saw happen.
yeah, no, I have been wondering with all the cuts to federal government now, uh, and loss of jobs, is that something that is going to lead to more crime?
I think it's very plausible. I think that's a very good question that we know going into right now that crime is low. Violent crime is extraordinarily low for sort of historically where we've been, and it is falling fast. Whether or not that will reverse is, I think, the question of the next 18, 24 months. Um, um, I don't know the answer to that, but that's what makes the surge in murder in 2020 and the TikTok and the Hyundai Kia video auto theft surge so interesting is that they turned on a dime. And usually it goes up a couple of percentage points, it goes down a couple of percentage points. We usually don't see massive changes in our crime trends. Our crime trends are like an enormous cruise ship. They take a while to turn one way or another. And so we certainly haven't seen a massive sudden reversal. I wouldn't expect to see a massive sudden reversal, but it's certainly plausible that as all of these cuts chip away at our capabilities and chip away at the local economies and the availability of local programming and things like that, that yeah, we'll start to see a change. I'm hopeful that doesn't occur, but it's certainly plausible.
Yeah. You were talking about the years before COVID, and you were talking about where the trend stood compared to historical numbers. Where were they in 2021, 2022 compared to historical level?
So 2021 is really hard because the FBI, they had this NIBRS switch. Basically, the FBI mandated that agencies switch reporting systems from the old system that they'd been using for a century to this new system, NIBRS. Only 60% of the country's population was covered in it. So when the numbers came in, they only had 60% rather than 95% that they normally get. So they made some guesses. The guesses aren't very good. It's sort of in an asterisk year. Let's throw that out. We can use something like this real-time crime index tool that we've built that takes data from 400 or so cities and measures the change over time in those cities and shows that murder was about where it was in 2020, in 2021. Violent crime was about where it was in 2020 and 2021 in nationally. Property crime was still low because the coronavirus was still running rampant. Maybe it was up a little bit from 2020, but it wasn't up a ton. And then 2022, we sort of got more of the same, maybe a slight decline in murder, more or less even in violent crime, probably a slight increase in property crime. But again, that's just because people went back to stores. Stores were open. Property crime usually relies on randomness in a way that some violent crimes don't. And so there was this enormous increase in not an enormous increase, but there was an increase in property crimes in 2022. And then 2023, we had a sort of weird situation where property crime probably fell, but in spite of the fact that auto theft surged. So we've had it's been very weird to see our crime trends change over the last 5 years.
So when it increased in those years you described, how did that compare to historical data in terms of violent crime or murders? Because you said in 2014, I think we were at a low rate in many, many decades for murders.
Yeah, I mean, in 2020, we had a almost 30% increase in murder, which the previous largest 1-year increase was like 12.5%. So it was much, much larger than any increase that we'd ever seen. And we kind of stayed at that level in 2021 and 2022. The violent crime increase was closer to about 5%. It was much more muted. It was, you had various things going on, but murder makes up a very tiny factor, a tiny portion of overall violent crime. Aggravated assault went up. Robbery and rape, which similar to property crimes are more based on randomness and mobility, they tended to go down. And so it's harder to do robberies if nobody's going out and on the streets. So that's generally what we saw in those years. Murder had increased from its sort of historic low in 2014. It had gone up in 2015, 2016, and then it had gone down in 2017, up in 2018, down in 2019. So it was kind of like stabilized at this post 2014 level, and then it had this enormous surge. And now we're back to probably that 2019 low, probably, honestly, over the last few months exceeding where we were in 2019, and most likely below where we were before the pandemic.
So if I'm remembering, that means we're at historical lows in some categories of crime.
Yeah, I mean, violent crime overall, the violent crime rate in the nation is probably the lowest we've seen since the 60s or the 70s, early 70s. Property crime was already at the lowest it was in the 60s, and we're seeing that go down. So yeah, we're probably seeing property crime at the lowest since the 60s. Murder, I don't know that we'll eclipse the 2014 levels, but we'll probably be well below where we were in the pandemic and closer to the historical lows than we've been in quite some time.
So I hear people talk and I see people write about the fact that crime, let me put it this way, the perception of crime by some in the community is very different than the actual data. Is that something that you've studied?
Yes, I'm sure there are people that have studied it more out of frustration than anything else. Gallup does their annual poll showing perceptions of crime, and usually there's a partisan gap. When a Republican president is in there, Democrats tend to think more than Republicans that crime went up, and vice versa. In 2024, the gap was beyond enormous. It was like 90% of Republicans think crime went up, 60% of independents, and 28% or something like that of Democrats. And so we're in this weird position where perceptions of crime are now frequently being driven solely by partisanship. For the most part, I think people struggle with evaluating crime trends because it's hard, and because if I can't tell if an increase in anecdotes of the local news telling me that there were robberies 3 days in the last month. How many robberies did they tell me last year that there were? And so in a lot of places where we don't have good data, it makes it very difficult to evaluate and contextualize crime trends. And it makes it very easy to always think that things are getting worse when in a lot of places they're getting better. And it's just as important to study that and understand why, so that you can keep that trend going, keep the good times rolling.
So if you're a community member and you really want to understand about crime, what do you look at? Or how do you find that out? What would you recommend?
What I tend to do is go to the raw crime data and build graphs and charts and dashboards and things like that. I don't think the random community members tend to be good
For
at that.
those of us who don't like math and that kind of thing, where do we go?
So, I mean, usually a lot of police departments are publishing their data. I think the more police departments that publish the raw stuff, the better. That allows us to better understand what the data actually shows, and it allows for people like me to build tools that allow you to understand it better. Like any large government agency, police departments tend to put the best foot forward. Sometimes it's well earned, sometimes things are going badly and it's not as well earned. And so I think that the more we have just sort of neutral data, this is the information, these are the offenses, all of that, the better. Places like Minneapolis, that the police department does have public data. It also has a dashboard that you can go to and you can see what the year-to-date numbers are. the state of Minnesota also publishing all of those data sets. So you can understand what the numbers show, understand how things are changing, and be in a position to at least minimally evaluate whether things are getting better or getting worse.
Is there anything about Minneapolis that's an outlier in what you see in national crime trends?
I think from a murder standpoint, I know this year that Minneapolis has had a very good start to the year,
Yes.
but in general, Minneapolis has not seen the large decline that we saw nationally. Murder has come down a little bit, I believe, from where it was in 2021 and 2022. But 2024, it was what, roughly even
Yes.
to where it was in 2023. So in a year where we had probably the largest 1 year decline ever recorded nationally, there are cities where it's just been stubborn. And, there's certainly, Minneapolis is not the only city like that. There are places like Charlotte and Baton Rouge that saw increases in murder. There are places that saw large increases. There are many more places that saw large decreases. But whenever you have a crime trend, we talked about some of the factors and how I think they're mostly national, but they're not exclusively national. There are likely local factors, likely local things that go into play, and there's likely randomness and luck as far as the percentage of people that get killed by shootings each year, and that tends to bounce around from year to year. So all of these things, I think, don't necessarily make Minneapolis an outlier, but certainly makes it not clearly following the national trend as closely as other places are.
But in 2025, we have a really good start on that.
Yeah, and lots of places are having that, and I've talked to lots of media and other places where and every city wants to be like, well, how special are we? And I was like, I don't mean to throw cold water on anything, but I'm going to name 12 other cities that are also experiencing historic declines right now, and that didn't, it certainly shouldn't degrade your feeling of accomplishment, and it certainly doesn't cheapen the fact that you're seeing a real decline. But at the same time, it's not just the special things are happening here type of thing. But in another sense, it shouldn't matter what's happening everywhere else or whether or not this is part of a national trend or a statewide trend or anything. It's a success that's happening in your city, in your neighborhoods, and that should be appreciated. It should be studied. It should be learned from and hopefully continued.
So, Jeff, what are you working on now that you're really excited about?
Well, I think I'm going to take the kids to get ice cream after school today, so I'm excited about that. So I guess I have a few hours though. From a more professional standpoint, we have a project, the Real-Time Crime Index, where, like I mentioned, we're getting data from, usually we have about 440 or so agencies of data, and we have about 350 agencies of complete data where we have every month back to 2017 for these agencies, and that allows us to build a national sample to evaluate national trends as they occur. And we just started a couple weeks ago an expansion of that project to where we're going to bring in all of this historic data. So the FBI has data back to 1930. Most of it, at least prior to the 1960s, is in scanned-in PDFs. Other tables and other data sets are available from 1960 to 1994 in scanned-in PDFs. And they digitized some of that, but it really requires coding skills. So if you wanted to go look up Minneapolis murders from 1930 to 2023, the data exists. It's just not easily accessible. And so we're going to make that accessible through this project. We're going to look at crime. We're going to do staffing. We're going to do clearance rates, and we're going to make it so that you can see, if you want to look up statewide murder rate comparing 1965 to 2023, you can't do that without sort of advanced coding knowledge or knowledge of these PDFs. And so we're going to basically digitize and democratize all this data and make it all available. So I'm very excited about this. I think it's going to be hopefully a very useful resource and will be something that people will be using for years to come.
And when you say we, who are you referring to?
My company, Age Datalytics, we have a grant agreement. We're being funded by Arnold Ventures, which does amazing work in the criminal justice space. So we feel very fortunate to have partnered with them on this. They've been incredible supporters, and We have a team for the Real-Time Crime Index. We have a team of 3 people, and then we have a handful of various different contractors and companies that are providing all sorts of different services to make this become a reality. So it's very exciting.
And what other ways can people follow you?
My Substack that we mentioned, jasher.substack.com, and I write a weekly newsletter that's got lots of fun information, I think. And if you go
It
to
does. I highly recommend it.
there you go. I'll take that. And then the Real-Time Crime Index, realtimecrimeindex.com. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter that comes out and describes changes. We are in the process, we're redesigning. We launched in September, our sort of beta version. We're redesigning everything. We're loving feedback and anything like that in terms of how to make it easier to use. And sometimes the feedback is like, well, you should have data back to 1922 on here. It's like, well, that'd be a great idea. We can't do that. And sometimes the feedback is extremely useful. So it's been cool to see and sort of snowballing and more people picking it up, which is fun.
Well, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So we are joined by Josh Peterson, who's our data expert. And we're going to have a conversation about data and how we use it in the office to follow up on the conversation with Jeff Asher. Josh, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here. It's an honor. Thanks.
Can you talk to us about how data can be used and useful for problem solving in a prosecutor's office?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the premise for this podcast is right on, right? The idea that we don't have to choose between public safety and reform. And within that, some things are the status quo because of years of trial and error, and years of trial and error have shown that those things work and it's the best way to do things. But other things are status quo for a whole bunch of other reasons. It might be inertia, it might be a lack of time to come up with innovative ways to do things. It might be systematic oppression, all sorts of reasons, right? But a big part of sort of effectively navigating this balance, I think, between public safety and reform is being willing to innovate. And so not being afraid to try new things, I think, is really key here. But within that, it's important, I think, to not just sort of blindly try things, right? As we're innovating in this world, I think that we need to really sort of follow the research and follow the evidence. Lots and lots of really smart people have done lots of really, really great work in this field, studying the challenges and studying solutions. And I think there's lots to learn from that science and from that evidence. Excuse me. And I think within that also, it's really important to be sort of systematic about this, right? So my background is in public health. People might think that criminal justice issues are not public health issues or vice versa. People think about public health and they think about infectious disease prevention or smoking cessation or seatbelts, right? But really, violence and criminal justice issues are public health issues. They're inextricably intertwined to things that we call social determinants of health, which is basically a sort of a fancy public healthy term for the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. And so those things are public health things. And so when we're thinking about public health, we're thinking about criminal justice, we're thinking about violence, really public health approaches can be really useful in terms of problem solving, and data and evidence are core parts of the public health approach.
Yeah, so it's interesting. As we know, the U.S. Surgeon General declared firearm violence a public health crisis in 2024. But there hadn't been, and there still hasn't been, a lot of data and research on gun violence. I know there's some, but that was really discouraged, I think, from the federal government. They didn't want people doing research on gun violence. How is that set researchers and people who's in public health who want to study gun violence back, not having that kind of data?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big issue. So a core part of the whole public health approach to problem solving for any problem, the first step in that approach is identifying and defining the problem. You can't do any of the further steps until you identify and define the problem. And so without funding, without support for researching gun violence, you can't even understand the full scope of the problem. And for years in this country, it's been really hard to really fully understand that because of those restrictions you mentioned. And a ton of really great folks have worked to fill those gaps. At the state level, there are some folks who are collecting data. Our Minnesota Department of Health has a violent death reporting system dashboard that has some really good data on gun violence. But that's only part of the picture. And so in order to really understand public health approaches to these problems, we need to be able to have that data. That's really key.
So you've talked about a public health approach. What does that mean exactly to problem solving?
Yeah, so I just gave a sneak peek of step one in that, which is identifying and defining the problem, right? So first you have to understand what it is you're actually focused on. What is it you're concerned about? Collecting data is key to that. Once you've understood the problem and sort of defined the problem, the second step is identifying factors that might contribute to the problem or that might sort of mitigate the issue or the problem. So what are some of the causes? What are some of the risk factors? What are some of the protective factors? So once you've understood the problem you're dealing with, you've understood what might be causing this, what we can do to potentially mitigate it, then it's thinking about what are some prevention strategies that might work. And that's where the research and the literature comes in. Again, all sorts of great work has been done identifying risk factors and identifying potential prevention strategies. And so you've done all that work, you understand you've got a good prevention strategy. Then it's about ensuring widespread adoption. So you've got a great program that works, a great policy that works. How can we spread this broadly across the population? And so data and evidence are really key in all of that, right? So we can't understand the problem unless we have the data, which we already talked about. When thinking about prevention strategies, again, there's been all sorts of great evaluations of programs. There's been all sorts of great research into causal factors, risk factors that can help identify those prevention strategies. And then once you've got a prevention strategy you think might work, it's really all about how do we test that, right? So we need to collect data, we need to look at that data, we need to interrogate that data in order to really understand the impact of what we're doing, or maybe the lack of impact, so we can pivot. And then finally, once we implement solutions more broadly, again, the data collection and the monitoring doesn't stop because we need to understand, is this doing what we asked it to do in the first place?
So you heard me talk with Jeff about our youth auto theft initiative. And actually, I brought it up when he was talking about kind of the role of prosecutors' offices and how we traditionally, I think, don't have a role in preventative approaches. And I think at the point he was talking about, if law enforcement can't get us a case, there's really nothing that we can do. And so I said, oh, we're doing this youth auto theft initiative. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so to continue on with sort of my public health nerd hat on, this is a great example of the 4 steps of the public health problem solving approach, right? So you already mentioned the problem, which is that we had a significant increase in the number of youth auto thefts happening across the country here in Hennepin County, right? And so interrogating that a little bit further, we were thinking about sort of what are some of the contributing factors that might be leading to that? Well, so some things we identified were slow processing time, right? So the literature tells us that interventions are most effective for young people when the intervention happens close in time to when the behavior happens, right? And so if we've got slow processing time, the intervention happens 6 months, 9 months down the line, that young person may not necessarily equate that behavior in that system response.
So can I interrupt for
Please.
a moment and kind of explain or interject here? When we're talking about processing time, we're talking about the time when police get us a case. We're talking about the time that our office, the county attorney's office, takes to look at that case and to decide what's appropriate. We're talking about the time, like if we do decide to petition or charge, the time it takes for the court to get it on a calendar, for there to be an appearance, for there to be a next appearance. And one of the things I think we discovered is it could take many, many months, even over a year sometimes, for that young person to actually appear in court and at least have their case resolved.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so this slow processing time is not necessarily the fault of any individual, not necessarily the fault of any system, but really it's the fact that our system moves slowly, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. And that was sort of the purpose of this whole, public health problem solving exercise here. So slow processing time. I think the other thing that we recognized that there was a gap in services when no formal case was submitted to our office, right? And so I think talking to law enforcement, folks in our office recognize that often for young people who are engaged in risky auto theft behavior, everybody knows who these young people are to some degree, right? And everybody can sort of see the potential negative trajectory if the behavior continues. But if a case doesn't get submitted to our office, we don't have a way, previously, we didn't really have a way of addressing that. And so this was partly about recognizing, again, a potential causal factor was there was no response for these young people who are engaging in these behaviors, but there's no formal case. And I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think another piece too is even within that, there was sort of a lack of individualized community-rooted solutions, right? So the literature also tells us, in addition to having interventions that happen close in time to when the behavior happens, we also need interventions that are rooted in community, that recognize that engaging young people's support systems in those interventions is meaningful. Interventions are most effective when they're rooted in community. And so really sort of pulling out all of those potential sort of causal factors was a key part in that second step of sort of identifying and talking about the problem.
Yeah, what I was thinking about and forgot momentarily, but now I've remembered, is another or more data that we actually got from law enforcement analysts that unfortunately young people who are involved in car theft escalate to more dangerous behavior, maybe involving guns or carjacking or something like that, unfortunately within a matter of months.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that said to us, we can't not intervene. There has to be some intervention there because by the time that young person might actually get to our office, they may have engaged in some, violent activity. I mean, not that car theft is a good thing, but really hurt somebody with a gun or carjacking or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that was sort of step one in defining the problem, identifying those contributing factors. So step two then is developing prevention strategies. And so this is where we sort of took our understanding of the literature and examining the resources and the assets that we had in sort of dealing with some of those things we just talked about. So understanding what we can potentially do around speeding up processing time, understanding what we can potentially do around connecting young people and families to community-rooted resources. And so the sort of approach that we developed was twofold, really addressing those two things. One was for young people who are engaging in those risky auto theft related behaviors, law enforcement will just simply send us their name. They'll say this person is on our radar for potentially engaging in these behaviors. They could potentially use some help, see what you all can do. And then our office takes those and runs them through a series of databases here to see if they're already receiving services. If they're already receiving those services, then we let those folks know and they continue on doing what they're doing. But if they're not, then we hook them up with a social worker. And these social workers work with the young person, with the family around all sorts of community-based needs that a young person might have. And so for one young person, it may be food security, housing security, something like that. For another young person, it might be mental health services or getting re-enrolled in school. In any case, it was all about sort of that kind of individualized approach for those young people. And a key part of that too was working with our partners on that initiative. So working with our partners in law enforcement, working with partners in the probation and corrections system to make sure that for young people who do have formal cases, they're getting services earlier.
One thing that really surprised me was the number of young people who were not getting any kind of services. And that turned out to be percentage-wise, how much or how many?
Yeah, so the percentage of folks who are eligible because they're not getting other service is, I think, north of like 75%, a significant number.
So what we did was to run them through all the databases, and if they were already receiving services, we would screen them out. And the young people who weren't receiving services were screened into the program, and
That's
that
right.
was about 75%.
Yeah, so the number screened in is around 50%.
Okay.
Some young people are screened out as well because they've got active cases already going.
Right.
And so they aren't necessarily receiving services yet, but they have an active case that will result in services, and that's about 50%.
And that really surprised me. That means, yeah, 50% of these young people that law enforcement knew about, that were engaging in this risky behavior were not getting really any help.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, so with our prevention strategy sort of in tow, the next step then is testing that strategy. And so that was our pilot implementation. And so we rolled this out. We connected with law enforcement. We said, make referrals to us. We met regularly with law enforcement to talk about how it's going, to answer questions, to address barriers. And then a key part of this is we started collecting data, because within all of this work, it's great to innovate. It's wonderful to innovate, but it's not super meaningful if you're not collecting data and understanding the impact that you're having. And so we built a whole sort of tracking system for the initiative. We collected data about the referrals coming in, who they were coming from, the reasons they were coming in, why young people were screened out, why young people were screened into services. We also surveyed our partners about this to understand from them, how was the process working? What could we be doing better to improve this process to make it easier for you? Because ultimately, this is meant to be a resource for law enforcement. We're not trying to add additional burden on them. We're trying to make their lives easier by providing some of these services. And then we also looked at some of the data around processing times as well to understand really sort of how those system-oriented changes were working.
Yeah, you mentioned it was kind of an iterative process because we were working with law enforcement and other partners and trying to figure out how the process could be improved. And I remember a great frustration by law enforcement because they would see some of the kids that they referred out there engaging in this behavior, but they weren't able to see which kids were screened in and out. And so we could see from our data that the kids that they were actually seeing were probably the kids that had an active case or were already getting some kind of services. And so you worked on a process that would allow law enforcement to have more information so that they could see what was actually going on generally with kids.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, one thing, as you mentioned, we heard from law enforcement partners was it's a little bit difficult for us when we're making these referrals and then they're going into what seems like a black hole, right? We're not hearing anything back. And there were some intentional reasons for not providing all of the information back, and those are still here. We want to make sure that this process is not net widening, right? This process is not over criminalizing young people. And also, some of the services that social workers are providing are things that generally have some data privacy rules around them. So
Mhm.
we're limited in what we can provide back. But we also said, we hear you, we understand you, that makes perfect sense. We're going to give you back the information that we can. So we put into place processes where, exactly like you said, we were able to tell law enforcement back, these young people were screened into services, these young people were not screened in for services. For the young people who were not screened in, we were able to share back sort of reasons why young people aren't screened in. Because if a law enforcement agency sends us 20 referrals and they all get screened out for a reason, we don't tell them why, they might continue referring young people with those same criteria and then get frustrated that they're all getting screened out. So that two-way communication was really key sort of throughout all of this process.
So where did we end up with this program? How did data help us assess how well it was working?
Yeah, so a couple of key things we've been measuring. First is sort of from the process side of things. So looking at how many young people who are referred to services, social workers are actually able to make contact with. And that number is extremely high. It's near 100%. So social workers are attempting contact, with nearly 100% of participants.
Mhm.
We're also looking at how many they're able to make contact with, and that number hovers around 60% roughly. And there's all sorts of reasons why it's difficult to make contact with young people and families, whether it's contact information not being great, or young people and families being transient, or young people and families not necessarily having trust in the system to answer the phone call, right? There's all sorts of reasons. Then we also look at, among those who do answer that phone call or who do come into contact with the social worker, how many have actually received some services or a referral? And again, that number is quite high. So those process pieces are one part of it. We also are interested in sort of what's the outcome of those services, right? We want to know, are we doing what we said we were going to do in terms of the process, but also what impact is that having? And so we looked at whether the young people who engage in services actually have a new charged case after they're involved in services, right? So in other words, we were concerned about risky auto theft behavior. We intervened. The theory is that with our intervention, those young people shouldn't be coming back through the system. And so that's what we were looking at. And the numbers we've seen so far are really, really promising around that. We're seeing roughly sort of nearly 65 to 70% of young people who have been engaged in services have not had a new charge case since they came in, which again is really, really promising. This is a really complex issue. There are lots of factors that might be sort of contributing to that, but this is a new thing that wasn't here before. And there's a lot of reason to believe that having these individualized, community-rooted services are making an impact for young people and families.
What does the data show us about car theft? And I know um, because of clearance rate, I mean, it's hard to tell how many car thefts are committed by youth, but is there anything you can tell us generally about car theft here in Minneapolis or Hennepin County?
Yeah, so the data on car theft in Minneapolis and in Hennepin County is promising in 2025 as well. So in Minneapolis, motor vehicle theft is down 20% year to date. according to the Minneapolis Crime Dashboard. In our office, we've seen a really significant drop in the number of motor vehicle theft cases referred to our office, and also across the county using data from the state BCA Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, data that they gather from the law enforcement agencies in Hennepin County. We've seen a significant drop in motor vehicle theft cases this year as well.
So I remember hearing from our social worker who originally had started being the social worker in this project because it was in summer, and he's our truancy diversion person, saying that 100% of the parents, guardians, that kind of thing that he was able to reach said that they were not surprised that their young person was on the radar screen. And they also said, please help. We don't know what to do.
Yeah.
That was very telling, that the family knew that there were issues and they simply didn't know where to go for help.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And having worked in the violence prevention field for a long time, I've seen and heard that over the years, over and over and over. Some adult in a young person's life typically recognizes the potential negative trajectory that that young person is on and sees a need for help. And, one thing that folks sometimes around here say is that we are resource rich and access poor, right?
Mhm.
So there's all sorts of great resources out there, but it's not always easy to navigate them for young people and for families. And too often we're waiting until a young person is in trouble, is on probation, to open the window to those resources. And really, we should be opening that window much earlier. And this whole Youth Auto Theft Initiative is an attempt to do that, right? We don't need to wait until that young person picks up a case and is in front of a judge for them to be connected to a social worker. That doesn't make sense. And we in our office have the ability to understand the information. We have the connection to the partners, and we have the will, frankly, to do something about it. And so I think we created this initiative, and I think it's having some really positive impact.
Thanks, Josh. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about how we have used data in the office to help, I would say, with staff well-being, or maybe another way to phrase that is monitoring caseloads. And there was a particular system when I came in, and you've actually changed that in a major way. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and just kind of stepping back for a moment, I think that, we talked about how data is useful for understanding the impact of initiatives and innovation. I think it's also really key for anyone to be using data, anyone in this work to be using data to really sort of think about process improvement and quality improvement, right? And so I think this is a great example of how internally data can be useful for ensuring that we are effective, we are efficient, we are doing the best work that we can do. And so, yeah, when you came in and when I came in, there was a system in place that really looked at sort of staff workload from kind of this algorithm based on a number of factors that was maybe not always super useful and didn't always take all the context into account. And on top of that, maybe there was a little bit of inconsistency about how different managers maybe were using that. And so I think you rightly recognized, and the managers here rightly recognized, that it would be really useful if there was a tool that could help staff, managers, and leadership understand really what is the workload of a given attorney, a given team, a given division across the office. And so we worked with some wonderful help from some folks in IT and others. We worked to create a dashboard tool that sort of serves two functions. One, it helps sort of serve an audit function around some kind of administrative data capture, right? And so there are some flags on there to help folks understand, are they capturing the information they need to within our case management system? Because it's important to have quality data if we want to be able to draw conclusions from that data, right? But perhaps more importantly, it also talks about staff caseload and upcoming work for those staff. And so that tool, lists out by team, by attorney, caseload size, upcoming hearings, and it really allows the managers, the senior attorneys here in this office to have a really deep understanding of what kinds of workload their staff have. And that enables all sorts of really important conversations between managers and staff, because managers can come in informed in those conversations. They can say, well, Mary, you've got 12 hearings next week, and that seems like a lot. Can we help? Can we take something else off your plate? And that's really, really important because, as you said at the beginning, well-being, health are really key parts of what we're trying to do here. When you came in, you created a new strategic framework, a strategic approach, and in that strategic framework is prioritizing the health and the well-being of the folks in the office here. And one way to do that is to have an understanding of where folks might need some help, when folks might need some help. And this tool allows for that. It also allows for when new cases are coming in, managers can make informed decisions about where to assign them out. So they're not just basing it on, gut feeling or guesswork. And that's not to take anything away from anyone who was doing it away in the past. But this way, everybody's got the same tool. Everybody can do it in a way that is data informed, which is really, really big.
Yeah, and to be clear, this is an internal tool.
That's
And
right.
so somebody from outside the office, even somebody from outside that particular division,
That's right.
would not have access to it. And actually, to go back to the system that was used before, the office had a point system, and the way I understood it to work was that lawyers would check a box to get points if they set a case for trial, if they got assigned out for trial. And the points were used. Originally, the point was that they were used to monitor caseloads. And so I think one of the things we thought very deeply about is what do we want to incentivize or what do we not want to incentivize? And looking at somebody's caseload in terms of how many trials they have was kind of fraught with problems. In other words, somebody could be not, be challenged in the area of trying to manage their caseload, or it could be that they're backed up with a bunch of cases that need to be tried. So part of the system that you developed really gives our managers an opportunity to look at individual caseloads in a different way. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little, yeah, go ahead, talk about what are some of the things our managers can see?
Yeah, so they can see obviously caseload numbers, but then within that, they can see sort of the complexity of the cases, right? So you might have one attorney who has 80 cases on their caseload and another one who has 15. And you might say, well, that person with 80 must have way more work on their plate because 80 is more than 15, right? But the reality is maybe those 80 cases are, cases that are relatively simple compared to the others. And all work in this office is difficult and complex. So I don't mean to sort of minimize any work, but if someone has, sort of 80, property damage cases, that might be equivalent to 10 homicide cases, right? Because the homicide cases are more complex. They're more likely to go to trial. There are more witnesses involved. There's more evidence involved. There's all sorts of reasons why there's sort of a difference. So they're able to pull in that case complexity into that. They're also able to look at sort of how long cases have been assigned, how long cases are awaiting a decision from our attorneys, sort of all sorts of interesting things that can help provide some additional insights beyond just the number of cases. And to your point, the number of trials is one part of the equation of how busy someone might be, but it is not the only part of the equation. And if you just rely on that, you risk incentivizing the wrong things, right? An attorney who brings a bunch of cases to trial may have a bunch of cases that need to go to trial, or there might be other reasons why those cases are going to trial. And if we can think about sort of that individual case level decision making, we're all going to be better off and we're going to get better outcomes.
And I know our managers in the criminal division have called this revolutionary. And so thank you very much for developing that.
Yeah.
So Josh, I wanted to end on, why is transparency about data important, especially in the context of the criminal legal system?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a number of reasons. And, again, I referenced earlier your strategic framework that you put in place when you came into the office here. Transparency is a key part of that. And I think that it's really wonderful that you've recognized that and elevated it because it is really important for a number of reasons. So I think one, the criminal legal system can often seem a little bit sort of impenetrable from the outside, right? Like folks understand like there's a system and stuff happens in the system, but they don't necessarily understand what that stuff is and whose responsibility is what, right? And so, we've got a public data dashboard. I think it is a really valuable tool, but it's a valuable tool in sort of limited usage in the sense that it shows information about what happens with cases that are submitted to us by law enforcement. So sort of a really quick overview, if an offense happens in community, a crime happens, right? First of all, it may not be reported, and you and Jeff talked about this, but it may not be reported in the first place. But if it is reported, then law enforcement looks at it, and then they send that data up to the State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, right? So there's a whole separate dashboard that talks about the information that about sort of crimes that occur in community. But the ones that show up on our dashboard is a small sliver of that, because it's the ones that law enforcement get and that they solve or clear with an arrest, right? And so transparency, I think, is important in part because it can help people understand who plays what role in the system, right? And so if they're interested in what a county attorney's office does, well, our efforts to be transparent, I think, help that understanding. I think another key piece of it is just that, like, public safety is everyone's concern, it's everyone's issue, and we all have a role to play in promoting public safety. And everyone in communities should be able to be a part of that conversation. And if our data is behind closed doors and no one knows what's happening, they can't be a part of that conversation, right? And I think we started this conversation talking about innovation. And I think innovation in this work is great. But innovation in and of itself without collecting data is meaningless. But I would actually add, without transparency around that data is also meaningless, right? Because unless we can share the information and be honest about what we're seeing, we're not really going to make meaningful change. And so having people have access to that data allows for real conversations, allows for folks to advocate with their elected leaders, allows folks to advocate with you and have conversations really about how do we all create meaningful change together.
So, Josh, what's a project you're excited about?
That's a great question. So I talked about our data dashboard in the last answer. I'm excited about sort of thinking about how we can augment what we have available right now in terms of transparency to tell more of the story about what we're doing. So our dashboard has a whole lot of data, and it's really useful, particularly if you're a researcher, if you're a data nerd like me who wants to dig in, roll up your sleeves, and sort of pull some numbers down and see what you can see. But it doesn't necessarily always tell you what is County Attorney Moriarty interested in doing in her office, and how is her office doing in terms of those things that she says she wants to do, right? And so I'm interested in the idea of how we can sort of better communicate what the strategic priorities are of the office in a way that really makes sense from sort of a storytelling perspective for folks in community.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, thank you.